Obviously, the title of this video is a bit of an exaggeration. Although we can apply rigorous methods to counter many of our modern biases, the fact remains that anything we try to learn about ancient belief will be hampered by the fact that the ancients aren't around to tell us anymore. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and that's what I'm here to help with. How do you read mythology as close to the ancients as possible? Let's take a look. Karate! I'd like to give a quick shout out to Ikeda Hakubi for picking up the book In Bed with the Ancient Greeks for me off my wishlist. The note contained an apology for not being able to do a super chat, and I'd like to let you know that it's definitely okay. Any support any of you give for my channel should always be voluntary, and I don't want any of you to feel like it's compulsory or like you owe me something for my work. This channel is a labor of love as much as anything, and it means a lot to me that you all even show up to watch the stuff I make. With that said, anyone who's watched my channel for a while probably knows that I stand the heck out of Christiane Servanu-Inwood. Her book, Reading Greek Culture, which I'm going to be drawing on heavily for this video, radically altered the landscape of Greek cultural and historical research and upended almost a century's worth of presuppositions. Her attention to detail and concern for the perspective of the ancient mind is a true treasure. It's also nearly impossible to find. Few college libraries seem to have it, and it went out of print at the time it was published. I got lucky that I was able to get a retired university copy from Japan, and due to the Trump administration's messing with the postal service, it took over a month for it to get here. Given how hard it is to get, I figure there's no ethical issue with sharing the method that Inwood outlines about how one should go about studying ancient culture. First though, we need to lay some groundwork. For those who have seen my video on mythic contradiction, link in the iCard if you missed it, know that for every text there is an ideal reader. Umberto Eco explored this in his seminal work on semiotics, The Role of the Reader. Inwood started there and expanded her view outside semiotics into the realms of sociology and anthropology. She notes in the introductory essay that when studying culture, there are two main perspectives that one can take: emic and etic. We'll start with etic because it's the perspective most of us have when we're studying ancient culture. The etic perspective is that of the outsider or the observer. This is the default perspective of anyone who isn't a Boeotian from the 7th century BCE when reading Homer, for example. Even if you've studied Homeric Greek and are thoroughly familiar with the text, you still aren't of the culture that produced it. Contrast this with the emic, or native perspective. Homer's audience would have the emic perspective. Inwood proposes that although the emic perspective is forever inaccessible to us, we must work to remove our biases in order to get as close to it as possible when evaluating culture. Keep in mind, she was talking about Greek scholarship, and the method we're about to go through includes things like art and artifacts. But, as potential aspiring Hellenists, or even just interested folks who would like to understand the mythology that we all thought we knew when we were kids, this rigorous approach can help us avoid the pitfalls that many folks often run into when they say, decide Zeus is a predator based on modern perspectives, or get angry at Hesiod for his remarks on women. This isn't to say that criticism of ancient epic doesn't have its place. It's important to understand the roots of things like the damsel in distress trope or where misogyny may spring from, but when trying to understand a work of fiction in its ancient context, these approaches can do more harm than good. She opens that in her methodology, the first step is to explore the text in the most exhaustive detail possible, not choosing what's important within it until the whole thing has been poured through. Having a good translation is essential for this if you haven't studied the ancient Greek dialect that the original text is written in. I highly recommend the Leb translations, as they have the Greek on the left-hand page and offer frequent notes on translation choices, as well as commentary on the way that the translation has shifted over time. Inwood makes a point here that what we think is important is based on our own cultural biases, and it's only after we've explored a work thoroughly within its own cultural context that we can begin to see what was important to the writer. For example, people often skim through the long list of the heroic dead in Homer and believe his descriptions of their death are rather dry and emotionless. But if you take a deeper look with an understanding of poetic verse, you can see the tragic setup of each hero's cult. Look to ancient evidence and you often find the cities where those heroes were purported to have died are cult centers, and sometimes there are hints in the text as to what the cult was like. If you were skimming through to try to find out what happens next to Odysseus, you'd miss these key details. If you're going to a text to try and prove a particular theory you have, you'll often read this into the text, so do your best to approach from as neutral a point of view as possible when you first start your reading. Take notes and give yourself time to digest the information. The second stage Inwood lays out is to conduct separate analyses of the various aspects of the text, first in its own context and then in the context of other works of its kind in that era. She gives the example of a particular action taken in a particular tragedy. First, the reader needs to examine the action and the role it plays in the story. Did the character suffer for it? How did those around them react? correct? Were they vindicated in the end? After that, the action can be compared first to other tragedies by the same author, and then to other tragedies from the same time period and city-state. From this, a pattern may emerge about the attitude toward that particular action in ancient Greek society. An understanding of the text's particular genre and its conventions during that time period is also really useful. Many scholars have written books on everything from ancient tragedy to epic to comedy to poetry. If you can find a few and study a bit, or find a translation with a good commentary, you'll be well on your way to completing this portion. For example, ancient tragedy often shows the effect of hubris, or the pride to excess that causes a human to violate the cycle of reciprocity with the gods in some way. Oedipus Tyrannus illustrates a terrible tale about fate and denial, but it also shows us the role that Sophocles felt humans play in determining their own destiny. In the sequel play, Oedipus at Kolonos, there are detailed explorations of the nature of suppliants and whether or not politics or the nature of their crimes should play a role in protecting them. When read together with Antigone and a firm grasp of the concept of suppliants, a bit of background knowledge on the state of Athenian politics being commented on in the play, and some knowledge of the 4th century BCE Athenian culture, you can glean a great deal of knowledge about the particular commentary Sophocles meant to make. If you also happen to know that his plays were likely contemporary with Aeschylus, you can compare and contrast their particular takes on these concepts. Suppliants and libation barrows from Aeschylus make commentary on similar themes in the same genre, and yet come to different conclusions about the nature of the concepts explored. These plays are part of an evolving dialogue going on at the time and can illustrate the diversity of ancient thought, but we must examine each of them first within themselves, and then subsequently and independently in the light of the culture and of the area and the era, other works by the same author, and contemporary works by different authors. Seems like a lot of work, doesn't it? It is, but it's important to do this to strip away as many of our own contemporary biases as possible. This doesn't mean we have to fully adopt the attitude of the authors in our daily life as part of our reconstruction if we're reconstructionists necessarily, though it can help us understand where many of the ideas we do still carry come from and what role they played. In my video on Homer's view of the afterlife and whether or not the dead were sentient in his eyes, I referenced Inwood's exploration of the various ways he talks about the dead throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. She came to the conclusion that the, quote, witless dead, unquote, must have been an earlier belief that lingered in the epic, contrary to scholarship at her time, because in parts that didn't appear due to linguistic structure to emerge from older epic, Homer has the dead doing things that mindless dead shouldn't be able to do without drinking blood. Without a very close examination of the text on its own merit first, she would never have been able to determine this, and instead would have relied on the existing scholarly preconception that because Minoan tombs appeared to have an afterlife across the sea that was joyous for nobles and artisans, the Greeks of the 7th century must have integrated a part of that into their more contemporary dismal view of the afterlife, rather than the other way around. However, as she illustrates, the text itself doesn't support this, and when we consider the ideal reader, or in Homer's case, listener, we see that they clearly would have perceived contradictions in their contemporary beliefs if the witless dead were indeed the modern opinion. Instead, we see only a bare few references to the dead being mindless and quite a number of the dead acting as though they can see, hear, and think without drinking blood. They may not know much about the world above as they're trapped in Hyades, but they're far from mindless. From here, Inwood notes that the portrayals of gods and goddesses must then be examined, first within the text itself, then the era and area, including with existing knowledge of cult, and only after can the pan-Hellenic or global view of these deities be considered as a part of the text. In other words, the gods cannot be assumed to be viewed the same across city-states, as cult and myth in each area affected the view of them. As I mentioned in the video on mythic contradiction, in Athens, Poseidon and Athena were considered to be at odds, but later in history, in a different area, she was considered to be Poseidon's daughter. The gods are not pan-Hellenic in myth. The Athena of the Odyssey is slightly differently characterized than the Athena of Hesiod, than the Athena of the Homeric hymns, than the Athena of the myths of Rechteos. Each story had its own place in history, era, and area, and its own cult significance. Understanding that if the story comes from Boeotia, it's going to have different influences than a story from Attica can help you resolve seeming inconsistencies in the myth and get closer to the intended themes and meaning. Remember also that although parts of myth were taken as literal history, or at least honored as such, the majority of Greeks did not appear to be mythic literalists. The interplay between myth, history, language, and culture is complex and layered, and even studying your entire life, that emic perspective will be forever out of your grasp. However, when you examine the myths in the systematic fashion that I outlined here, you'll at least get quite a bit closer than the average person who reads them as simple fiction and allows their cultural paradigms to intrude on their understanding. So, to recap, here's the method. First, read over the text and translation carefully, keeping notes and pushing your biases to the side. My patron bonus video on how to research history is coming out this Saturday, link in the iCard here once it's out, and in it, I both link a website and ask a few questions that you can use to guide yourself in this respect. Don't decide what's important about the text until you've given it a thorough read. Make notes on the language used and anything the translators felt the need to point out, if you don't know the dialect the text come from. Then, independently of one another, examine the text in light of other evidence. First, with other texts by the same author if they exist, then within the same genre, era, and area. Research the author a bit to see what you can glean about their perspective. Try to find information about the genre conventions of the genre that the text comes from. Then, examine the role the gods play within the text, first from the perspective of the text itself, then the particular era and area, then finally with the pan-Hellenic or general perspective in mind. Do your best not to let these analyses influence one another, and draw your conclusions only at the end, once you've examined as much evidence as you can. You don't have to apply every single step to every single myth you read, but if you do choose to undergo this process, you may well find your appreciation for the masterworks that we've inherited deepens. I know I still find myself blown away by the complexity of Homer and Hesiod, the criticism of religious norms in Aeschylus, the examination of the human capacity to change in Sophocles, the snark and wit of Aristophanes. Taking the time to familiarize myself with these cultural elements and carefully examine the texts themselves has opened up a whole new layer of understanding for me, one that informs my religious practice to this day. I hope that should you attempt this daunting process yourself, you too will reap the benefits of deepened understanding and appreciation. It's truly wonderful, and that level of critical thinking can only help you, whether you intend to apply what you've learned to religious practice or merely want to understand these works better than you did before. There isn't a shortcut to a deep understanding of ancient culture, and much work lies ahead for anyone who desires to achieve such. But the rewards outweigh the work, at least for me. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here and weren't driven away by the daunting process I laid out, rigorously examine the subscribe button and leave no like unturned. Drop down into the comments and let me know how crazy I am for attempting this with multiple myths, or about how I should be doing this with the Bible because the Bible says so if that's your speed. Special thanks to GaelicNox for the channel art, link is always in the description to their Twitter and website, and special thanks to my patrons. I would never have been able to get my hands on Reading Greek Death if it weren't for you, nor would I have over half the collection that I have to explore the various aspects of Greek culture that I've used to apply this very method in my exploration of myth. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever be positive. And remember, we're stronger together.